There's a lot of fear with startups and founders. They're always like, hey, sign the NDA. I don't want you to steal my idea.
That's right.
You've been deliberate about, hey, come in here. We want you to be a partner. We don't want the IP. In fact, we're going to pre-assign it, and you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. After all of this experience, a bunch of value is going to be created, and we want the majority of that value to accrue to the entrepreneur. Now, our transaction is we take a little bit of equity, so we have exposure to the upside. It's a couple percentage points on their next round. It's not majority ownership or board seat or trying to control what's going on. It's really an exercise to self-reflect and say, what do we know about battery recycling? We know a bunch that could be helpful, but not about that particular technology. And we don't have the budget or interest to go and scale that. Like, we want you to scale it.
Welcome to Forging the Future. And today, I'm excited to have Scott Gale on the show. He's the Executive Director of Halliburton Labs, but he's also a founder, an investor, a board member, and a podcast host. So Scott, welcome to the show.
Chris, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me, man.
Sure. So tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up in Houston.
Yeah, sure. So, I grew up in a small paper mill town in the Pacific Northwest on the Columbia River, just a stone's throw from the Portland airport. And in that little paper mill town in Camas, Washington, grew up my whole life there. We were the Camas Papermakers. That was our mascot. Played an annual football game against the Tillamook Cheesemakers, so.
Does sound like a small town.
Pretty small town, and I would say it's grown quite a bit since, but sort of at that time, growing up, or in a paper mill town, you were kind of either a lumberjack or you're an engineer at the plant. And that's my rough cut of kind of how the world worked at the time. And some of the people that I looked up to, including my math teacher and my chemistry teacher, were retired engineers from the plant. And so I was like, man, these guys seem to know a lot about how the world works and what's going on. And so as I went to pursue an undergraduate degree, I declared chemical engineering as my major, really not having any appreciation for what a chemical engineer actually did. And what I found was, too, is sort of growing up, if anybody asked you what you want to be when you grow up, my response was always an inventor. And I sort of felt like understanding how the world worked might be a helpful way to build and problem solve. And long story short, sort of pursued a path that led me to the petrochemical space. Working for Dow Chemical, and they had a program where they take engineering undergrads and they gear you up to be a B2B chemical salesperson. And so went out to Midland, Michigan to go do that training, and still really had never been to Texas. And they said, hey, at the end of your training, we're going to ship you to Houston, and your first customer is going to be Schlumberger. And if that gives you an idea of how much they knew about the oil and gas space at the time, mm-hmm. And they were reading some McKinsey report.
Schlumberger,
kind of
yeah.
So I found myself moving to Houston in the late aughts and calling on Schlumberger down in Sugar Land, and that was it. It was basically a kind of a luck of the draw. My other kind of classmates in this program went on to go do building materials or automotive, or it could have been any market, and it just happened to be Houston and oil and gas. So that's how I got here.
I think that you could have pulled off the lumberjack vibe, actually.
Sure. No, I try and keep that going. Got some flannel in the closet.
Got some flannel, the beard, the voice, but I'm happy that you took the engineering route. So you talked about being an inventor. And I didn't really hear that in the story so far, right? So once you got to Houston, what really drove you toward entrepreneurship?
In my little high school, we had a bunch of trade schools, and it'd be massage therapist or culinary arts or whatever it might be. And I was quite interested in being a chef at the time. And so I came home and I had a conversation with my dad. I was like, hey, I think I want to go to the Portland Culinary Arts School. And without skipping a beat, my dad was like, how about you do something that doesn't result in you living in my basement?
I think a lot of dads want to say that. Kudos to your father for actually vocalizing it.
Yeah, no, he was quite serious about it. And, his follow-up comment was, in his view, cooking or being a chef was a hobby. fair or not fair. But I think what was clear to me is like the connectivity with what I would term as like the creative class broadly. Like I played guitar and piano kind of growing up, enjoyed like storytelling and other things, but I was like the math science kind of kid, and chemical engineering was a challenge for me, but I did like a business minor in my undergrad experience. I was one class away from having a Portuguese minor. Did a bunch of all the entrepreneurship electives that I could, but met my wife at the beginning of my sophomore year of college. We were married at the end of our sophomore year of college. And so we had this startup marriage and had a 6-month-old daughter when I graduated and went to take my first job. And so my risk profile was quite different in terms of like wanting to kind of build something or invent something or create something. And so I scratched that itch by being a B2B chemical salesperson early in my career, which involved a lot of problem solving and trying to match solutions that I had in my kit with the problems that these organizations had. And so as I sort of self-reflect in my career, like I really had kind of this entrepreneurial kind of background and really centered around energy and oil and gas. I mean, after a couple of years of doing that job, kind of expanding my scope and getting connected with companies like Baker Hughes and Halliburton and a bunch of, drilling mud companies across the Gulf Coast and things, they wanted me to go do a marketing job in a different business unit, which is how they sort of, cycled employees through all these different businesses. And I thought solo cups and plastics and car bumpers were not as interesting as what was going on, particularly around hydraulic fracturing. So I left and moved to New Jersey to go work for a Belgian chemical company that had a giant portfolio in frac chemistry, guar and surfactants and biocides. And did that, but, supporting the oil and gas services industry from Princeton, New Jersey, you can only do that for so long. And so got closer to the wellhead by hiring into Halliburton and moving back to Houston. And again, sort of in a role that didn't exist, to build out a product management function for a newly acquired business. And so sort of interfacing with technology and the commercialization of technology and how those things sort of operate at scale were all kind of early scars that I kind of got along the way and kind of some muscles built. And eventually sort of being in the Houston area, and particularly when I was in the Northeast, was looking at MBA schools and kind of thinking about what that might look like, but had an interesting experience with a colleague who really sort of got rice on my radar. And so I do think that like going and pursuing a Rice MBA, given their connectivity to entrepreneurship broadly, was sort of this like formal step to try and, I guess in my mind, like de-risk an entrepreneurial experience to build some skill sets and network. So a long way to sort of kind of come about this this entrepreneurial kind of itch, but doing it through a bunch of entrepreneurial experiences in big established companies trying to drive disruption and change.
So you went through Rice's business program then?
I did, yeah. I did an executive MBA there while running Halliburton's hydraulic fracturing strategy and traveling around the world to complicated places where those activities happen. And it was a fantastic experience. Had the opportunity to build the Jones Student Association for executives, which didn't exist at the time. And so trying to create better connective tissue across the programs that were there, as an example.
Was that really your entry into the Houston ecosystem initially?
Part of that opportunity, I was sort of asked like, hey, how does someone with my background get closer to entrepreneurship? You've got Al Danto's classes, you've got the Rice Business Plan competition, you've got these things. And I sort of felt like I wasn't in that experience to say like leave my day job and go like cannonball into some new thing. By that point, I had 4 kids and kind of picked them up as souvenirs along the way. One born in Texas the first time, one born in New Jersey, one born in Texas the second go around. And so I got connected with a mentor group that was mentoring medical tech startups for MD Anderson's venture mentor system. And so getting sort of connected with some like-minded mentors and helping to bring some of my scar tissue to the table for founding teams. And so that really helped me to start to just think about how innovation happened broadly and outside of oil and gas. And And so that was something that was quite interesting, and sort of coming out of, as my MBA kind of experience was wrapping up, a pharmaceutical executive who was a classmate and I were putting together a venture fund concept as sort of like the pumps and pipes kind of intersection of where medical and energy could sort of collide. And that was, I'd say it sort of mostly was like a thought exercise of like what could be real, what has to be true to sort of make this happen, and building kind of a thesis. And so we were kind of in a little bit of that state when got the phone call to come and start to do the work for what eventually became Halliburton Labs.
What did they want you to do initially if it wasn't Halliburton Labs?
I would say the exercise sort of started broadly as like a strategic question of like, what are Halliburton's core competencies and how might they be applied outside of oil and gas applications? So a little bit of a self-reflective exercise, looking at the IP portfolio of Halliburton's IP. Could something be applied elsewhere? Is there other IP that could be applied internally? And so that's sort of how it started. And then sort of turn into a discussion of, where does innovation come from? What are the features and factors that have to be present for innovation to come about? And so, we spent time with like Walter Isaacson, who has, written books about Da Vinci and Steve Jobs, and has some very interesting perspective on the environment in the 1500s, whenever Da Vinci was in the Medici family, and what that meant, and Bell Labs and how that stood up. We had conversations with John Gertner, who wrote The Idea Factory, and starting to try and get an understanding and contextualize what are the components of innovation in an effort to break outside of, this pretty common corporate challenge of this not invented here mentality, like who knows our business better than we do kind of thing. And so a concept started to form around how we might be able to interface with early stage companies that are driving new, innovative solutions for kind of the future of energy.
So speaking about Halliburton Labs, tell me a little bit more about it and what your role is there.
Sure, yeah. So, Halliburton Labs is, we like to call ourselves a community of doers that get scale done. And it's kind of a front door to Halliburton's scaling resources. We've built a lot of capability around design for manufacturing, scalability, supply chain, country entry. We operate in 70 countries around the world, 50,000 employees. And early stage companies, particularly those that are working on hardware-centric kinds of technologies, it's just different than scaling software, right? It's just the iterations are more expensive, more protracted. The capital has to be more patient for those that are investing in it. And big established companies have a bunch of skill sets and capabilities in spades, but that interface between corporates and startups is tough. And so what we've created is an experience for an early stage company working on something in the energy space broadly that Halliburton isn't already working on, where they can gain access to that practitioner skill set to sort of help problem solve in real time. So we serve as an extension of their founding teams, as like a triage unit to help connect them to those skill sets, whether those are in Halliburton's network or outside. And so that's that program, that experience has been in place for a couple of years. We've got 32 portfolio companies around the world. These are companies in Singapore, Finland, UK, India, Canada, all the time zones across the US. And so we don't require them to be in any particular geography. And some take advantage of our facilities, whether those are lab facilities or
because you have a wet lab
facilities.
there, right?
We've got a wet lab. We've got kind of some maker spaces, but we also have, supply chain and manufacturing footprint in other places around the world that we've activated on behalf of early stage participant companies. And so a couple times a year, we inhale some applications, we do a review process. Not helpful for the release schedule of our conversation, but today happens to be a deadline for our application window. So midnight tonight, we'll draw, an artificial line in the sand, and we'll review some applications, and we'll do a pitch event on March 14th in New Orleans. And 10 companies will be featured as a part of that. And of those 10, we'll select a handful, 3 to 5. And we do that exercise a couple times a year, and that's what's gotten us to 32 so far. And they're working in things across the energy landscape, from industrial decarbonization to upcycling of waste materials, carbon life cycle, drone infrastructure.
How do you find those companies? Or they just find you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, one of the questions we ask in the application is, how did you find us? Or, how did you hear about Halliburton Labs? And we have an active scouting organization, 2 folks that are dedicated to that, spend all their time reaching out and kind of finding people to chat with and connect with, whether those are through university programs or the investor community broadly, as well economic development groups in different communities around the world, trade associations. I mean, we're agnostic to where we find them, but certainly referrals that come to us from investors or participants. As we've been sort of reviewing these applications, I always love to go down and see how they found us. Some of them find us on LinkedIn. Some of them, their professor at Stanford said they should. Some of them, their investor said they should. They had a friend that did the program and heard good things. So like all those things are sources. And certainly getting more, I would say, like warm inbounds versus when we started in the early days. You're really just like beating down people's doors and just kind of, begging them to take advantage of the experience.
Yeah, we've had Mike Francis on the show from Nanotech, and he's been, he's spoken very highly about how supportive Halliburton has been through several startups, I believe, for him. And I know he's also at the lab space there.
He is, yeah. I was just in his little part of the campus today with our friends from Greentown Labs. So I think that, Mike's a great example of a company that was batch mixing material in a brew tank in their driveway, and now they've got, we're moving into a large 40,000 square foot space, and to bridge from driveway to proper facility can be a pretty expensive endeavor. And so really the spirit of what we're trying to do, the founding principles being founders first, giving before you get, and learning by doing, is to lower the friction of what it takes to be an entrepreneur in that space.
So how can corporate companies add value to startups?
I think it's interesting because, startups have a bunch of needs, right? We obviously think of it, Brad Feld says it well, like access to, there's like 7 different capitals, right? You need sort of like network capital, you need kind of infrastructure capital, you obviously need the financial capital, the human capital, all these things. And so I think that there's, interesting programs, models that get stood up that kind of help to facilitate access to those things. And big established corporates have customer relationships, they have facilities, they have a bunch of scar tissue that they developed for scaling their business and all these things. And often access to those scaling resources is sort of unattainable without selling to a corporate or making a tough decision around IP or whatever it might be. And so I think for us, like we really tried to, as I mentioned, like reflecting on what our core competencies are, how that in that give-get equation, what could we bring to the table? And I think a couple of the barriers to that I think, corporates could think about in kind of a self-reflective exercise is big established companies have this kind of convergent mindset. And I think it's super important when you're driving efficiency in the business. You're thinking about quarterly returns. You're thinking about health, safety, environment. Like you've got to have process that's repeatable, executable, that when somebody leaves the organization, someone else can slot in and not, it's not disrupted. So, you're really building this like process-oriented kind of thing. Well, one of the trade-offs as you do that, if you're not careful, is you close yourself off to emergent opportunities. And it's one of the challenges, I think, for corporate venture, where you've got to be strategically tethered to the run rate business. And by doing that, also you create this natural constriction of the horizon. Because in your day-to-day conversations, you're not meeting with people outside of the hedges of how you operate and where you fit in your value chain and other things, and it exposes you to potential disruptions. So it's like this big question, like, why couldn't Marriott have, invented or come up with Airbnb? They were so focused on kind of executing their business that, why couldn't the automotive industry come up with Tesla? And I think there's this, there's a great book out there written by a friend, Linda Yates, called The Unicorn Within, that like explores a bunch of like those challenges. And I think that we've like lived that as Halliburton, where we, one of the lines of demarcation is IP. Like big corporates want to have ownership of the things that they're developing. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, we were looking at how could Halliburton IP be scaled outside of oil and gas. Well, how many patents have achieved that? It was a very small number. I'd argue it was probably close to zero, if not zero. And so it was like, we're kind of potentially arguing over things that are going to keep us from getting exposure to these emergent opportunities. And so one of the things we got to was we don't take ROFRs or IP rights or, any kind of corporate overreach for the startup that is going to come and participate with us. We actually pre-assign any jointly developed IP that might come out of this experience. We pre-assign it to the startup. And so that's a decidedly, not a traditional corporate kind of approach. And so I think the challenge becomes around sort of how to think about and balance the risk and the uncertainty of it, but also the opportunity. And so for us, it's a strategic outcome of illuminating these nascent value chains. They're undercapitalized, and the future energy system is going to be made up of tons of technologies that we haven't even heard about yet, right? The old adage that the future's here, it's just not evenly distributed. Mm-hmm. We're trying to find where those technologies are and see if we can't sort of help further that along and contribute some of these capabilities and skill sets. But it can be a challenge because the immune system of the organization is built to snuff those kinds of things out. And when something new or different shows up, the antibodies are well established and they come out and, hey, we can't do this or we shouldn't do that or we've never done that before. And so I think just embracing a little bit of that uncertainty, I think, is important. And I like to think that the way that Halliburton Labs was structured was quite strategic and quite sort of smart in how it was thought through. Is it can be easy to say that to 50,000 employees around the world, like, hey, we're interested in the future of energy. And now all of a sudden everybody's running around distracted. Nobody's thinking about the run rate business. And so having sort of a small group of people seconded to it that are thinking about it, building connective tissue and sort of de-risking future behaviors, I think is an approach that I think aligned well strategically and culturally with who we are as a service company. And so getting to a point where we're elevating an entrepreneur and an early stage company to the same level as like a customer. Like how do we respond to a customer? And so I think there's some interesting kind of power in that. But those are a few kind of issues and challenges that we've wrestled with as we've gone along.
It sounds like a little more of a unique approach in a lot of ways. I mean, certainly what's the old adage? Big corporations are where innovative ideas go to die, right?
Sure.
And there's a lot of fear with startups and founders. They're always like, hey, sign the NDA. I don't want you to steal my idea. And
right.
Certainly going to approach a company like Halliburton or get pulled into a lab, you think, well, you're going to pull me in like a fly into a spider net and bleed me dry, right? And then send me on my way and take all of my IP. And so you've been deliberate about, hey, come in here. We want you to be a partner. We don't want the IP. In fact, we're going to pre-assign it, and you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. After all of this experience, a bunch of value is going to be created, and we want the majority of that value to accrue to the entrepreneur. Now, our transaction is we take a little bit of equity, so we have exposure to the upside. It's a couple percentage points on their next round. It's not majority ownership or board seat or trying to control what's going on. It's really an exercise to self-reflect and say, what do we know about battery recycling or drone infrastructure or other things? Like, we know a bunch that could be helpful, but not about that particular technology. And we don't have the budget or interest to go and scale that. Like, we want you to scale it.
Yeah, we had Brian from Accenture on the show, and he was talking about some of the quotes on the wall and some of the logos, because some companies have that exact opposite approach of like a Blockbuster saying, well, why should we buy it from you? We'll just go and do it ourselves, right? And you know how that stuff turns out.
That's right.
Time and time again, but companies still make the same mistake. Also getting tech transfer out of both universities and companies where they try to have, I've seen this in Canadian companies and other companies, Canadian universities, et cetera, where they just want, they just put the burden of like, hey, we want 80% ownership of this startup because it's our thing, and it just kills it, right? Wouldn't you much rather own a few points of Google than like try to kill a company with 80% ownership because you partner with them on an idea?
Owning majority of nothing versus a little bit of something big.
Exactly. So you've been involved in the ecosystem for a while. We're both very passionate about startups and building ecosystems. What do you think is critical to build a thriving ecosystem, or what's still missing here in Houston?
Well, I mean, Chris, I've got a ton of respect for what you've built. I'm like a junior enthusiast in your shadow. So I think for me, I've just come to the realization that I think a lot of the wave of change that happens amongst humanity is done by first movers and people that are bold and sort of just imagine the world differently. And so I just have a ton of respect for entrepreneurs. And so I think for me, in sort of my study of startup communities and trying to think about where I could add my voice to the choir and sort of lift where I'm at, and given sort of all of my circumstances and for me personally. And so I think that, there's some real challenges around how communities come together. I think one of them is that having this longer run mindset, I referenced Brad Feld. I think his book, The Startup Community Way, is one of the better articulations of how some of these things work. And one of the things he talks about is this 20-year rolling horizon on strategy. And that's a tough thing to do, particularly, he also uses a term that Governor Hickenlooper is credited with coining called topophilia, this idea of love of place. And that's the foundation for how startup community in the ecosystem gets built. And there's some challenges if you've got kind of a transient workforce, if you've got people that are moving to different places around the world. If you're spending 2 or 3 years in any particular location, which I did early in my career, lived in a bunch of different places, it's hard to sort of catch that topophilia and feel like you want to contribute to that community, especially on a 20-year horizon. And so, I think that can create some challenges about what people are willing to do and sort of contribute. And so I think that's one thing that comes to mind is just the density. If we sort of talk about Houston specifically, the density of large corporations, that 20-year rolling horizon is a lot to ask for people to sort of see through the ups and downs and and think about it on that in that way. But then also that the center of thriving entrepreneurial communities is the entrepreneur. And I've said this lots of different times, but I think that an observation is a lot of wealth is generated in this part of the country through real estate, through trading, and through oil and gas extraction, which in a bunch of ways aren't necessarily tech founder, entrepreneur kinds of activities. And when that wealth is generated, often they'll go buy a ranch and disappear, and they're not plowing those resources back in, and not just the financial resources, but the mentorship and the scar tissue and sort of and driving that. And so I hold Softtech in high esteem for some of the things that you guys have done to sort of bring that perspective and those resources and showing up, because I think otherwise, the corporate sort of center of gravity can be quite difficult for entrepreneurs, because the funding is there, the walls and the desks and everything, but that network capital and that scar tissue sort of collision sharing and all that, I think is an issue. So Those are a few things that come to mind that I think are relevant challenges for the community at large. Outside of Houston, being an hour outside of Houston, there's not this natural center of gravity.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's exactly right. I mean, what I was trying to do with the venture fund and the venture studio is just recognizing that, there is funding there. So how do we aggregate that funding, but direct that funding not just to real estate and oil and gas and energy, right? I wanted to focus more on building technology because in my opinion, there's always been a lot of tech in Texas going all the way back to TI and Compaq and Dell and otherwise. But the money here was focused more on energy and real estate, and how can I help facilitate that? But not just give the money and throw money over the wall, but how do we provide additional mentorship, right? And so having the fund where we had bringing startups with great ideas, giving them some money, but don't just give them the money, but give them the mentorship into a studio program, which I didn't really see existed here in that exact format anyway. Something like a Techstars or a 500 Global that they do out in California, but do it here in Texas. And then pair them with builders. You're a builder as well. Pairing that with our 400 engineers that have been building the proof of concepts and MVPs for large corporations like you're talking about for 25 years, right? So putting those pieces together so they can actually get off the ground. But then more importantly, like you've said, once they succeed, we need them to stay here in Houston, be successful, have their exits, don't move to the ranch, create some of those millionaires that then are willing to create startups or fund additional startups and get that flywheel going, right? Instead of having to move to California or somewhere else to get those later rounds of funding. And so I do think it's really important to have companies like Accenture and Halliburton, Greentown, Softtech, trying to support that ecosystem here and keeping those founders here in Texas so that we can have that next round.
Yeah, I think it's so critical. I mean, when you look across, whether it's, Utah Valley and, the WordPerfect and Qualtrics now and Omniture, and you see sort of those communities are fueled by successful founders that show back up. And I think about like Blinds.com here in town with Jay Steinfeld, and then Omer Tariq is out, a successful CEO now who was a C-suite executive at Blinds.com. And so the recycling of human resources and financial capital to sort of drive entrepreneurial outcomes. Because that wildcatter spirit in Houston is real, but the how to build a tech company and how to sort of scale, I think there's some really unique features that are sort of present here in town that I'm super optimistic about. I mean, I think when you look at the medical tech and the space tech and just the deep engineering skill sets and understanding, and particularly in the kind of the energy world, like the understanding of what the energy system at scale looks like, needs, requires, all of those things I think bode well. So I think activating that kind of private equity dollar, but for like an earlier stage deal, I think is a unique opportunity. And so, yeah, super excited about the work that you guys are doing. And I've said it before, but like the scale of the energy system, we need like 50 Greentown labs in Houston to be able to like go achieve the like trillions of capital allocation that's going to be required. So it's a unique challenge.
What's something you're currently working on that's forging the future?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, building a coalition of kind of organizations that think about entrepreneurship for energy, climate, and have a history of executing events that convene, whether they're pitch events or thought leadership or whatever it might be. And one of the things that is kind of obvious is we sort of haven't coordinated on when those happen, and so we're working together to create a week where calendar coordination and cross promotion is kind of the spirit. And so between Halliburton Labs and the Rice Alliance and Greentown Labs and Activate and Renewable Energy Alliance for Houston, like a whole bunch of organizations, not a comprehensive list at all. There's going to be kind of a call to action for dozens of folks to come together the week of September 9th this year in 2024. lots of locations around the city. It's just really like if you're going to do an energy and startup and climate related event in say Q3 of 2024, think about doing it that week. And I think that's going to create some opportunities for those that might be on the coasts that like, hey, I got to come to Houston like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. And am I going to come for a half day thing or a day long thing or whatever? But sort of doing that together. So it's like kind of a can't miss, must attend, few days in Houston if you're thinking about that. So that's something that we're cooking on. We're excited to be building that.
Is that something Halliburton is spearheading, or where is that coming from, this coordination of Startup Week?
Yeah, no, it started last year. Brad Burke, he does an Energy Tech Venture Forum in September. It's always been the second week of September. And so we were going to do our pitch event at Denver Startup Week, and we were going to do it because it was the third week of September. And we've got, the Reggie DeRoche sits on our advisory board. And so our connectivity with Rice is quite important. We've talked about my connectivity with Rice, which I think is relevant. And we found out like in May that they had been bumped to the third week because the undergraduate business programming at Rice Business, which they launched, had bumped them out of their space. And so all of a sudden we were executing our events on the exact same day in different cities. And Reggie DeRoche was in Denver, and he was like, wait, the Tech Venture Forum's happening today? Like he didn't like realize that was the case. And so Brad and I were like, okay, we can get this right in 2024. And so we did a bunch of effort to like, when's the right time? What's this look like? And so we got together and said, we're going to do back-to-back events. Said, well, if we can coordinate, what if we socialize this with other friends in the community? And so everybody that we socialized with was like, that sounds really cool. That makes sense. Why haven't we done that in the past?
Interesting.
Now, because it's kind of never been done before in that way, there's this tendency to swing all the way to like, well, how is South by structured? And let's do it that way. And it's like, well, I think the South by was, a 30-year overnight success kind of thing. Like there's a lot of steps that we have to take. So that's why I say the spirit of it's calendar coordination and cross promotion.
Interesting. Well, Scott, thanks for being on the show.
You bet.
I learned a lot. Thanks for the tour the other day at Halliburton Labs. I've got some socks for you, some lab socks.
Oh, love it. Yeah, check this out.
Wear it with pride.
Some chemistry nightmares that'll come back to me. Love it.
Well, thanks for helping to forge the future here in Houston.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah.